To those of us who are old enough, raise your hand if you remember exactly where you were and what you were doing on September 11, 2001. I'm sure we all do. It's etched in our memories. Well, the same is true for all Norwegians when we think of July 22nd, 2011. That was today. Then 32-year-old Anders Behring Breivik blew up the government center in Oslo, got away, and drove the 20 miles to the island of Utøya, which is an idyllic, heart-shaped island about the size of 5 football fields. And disguised as a police officer, Breivik even got help to load and unload his heavy case full of weapons and ammunition onto the small ferry boat that would take him to the island. His plan was to shoot and kill all the members participating at the Labour Party's Youth League summer camp. His enemy was the multicultural, immigration-friendly Norwegian government and Norway's political future. Breivik killed 77 people that day, most of them teenagers. And if you look at the size of the population, it would be as if 5,400 people died in the United States. I heard the news on the radio, and I immediately turned on CNN, and I was glued to the TV the rest of the night. And I kept asking myself, how could this happen in my home country with its Nobel Peace Prize and 2.6% unemployment rate? This small nation of barely 5 million people with the second highest GDP per capita in the world. This kind of violence just doesn't happen in Norway. But isn't that what everyone says after a massacre like this anywhere? We live in a society where the focus is on fear. Watch any news channel and the conversation is always, what do we need to be afraid of? And whose fault is it? I'm not going to add to that fear. And I'm not going to point my finger and allocate blame. Fear and blame do not serve us. Instead of letting fear define us, we need to look beyond the symptoms and deeper into what's causing the disease. Before Breivik's massacre in 2011, mass shootings happened every 200 days in the United States. Since, there's a rampage killing every 64 days. Not all of these are lone wolf killers, but that doesn't matter, because many of the warning signs are similar. And what I've learned from my research and from working closely with the former FBI profiler is that we can spot these killers in the making, even if they have no criminal records. And I'm hopeful that we can stop them before it's too late. I also discovered that none of these killers were born killers, and it doesn't matter if they live in Norway or anywhere else. And as I dug into Breivik's past, I realized that his wasn't that different from mine. Breivik and I grew up in the same environment. We lived a 20-minute drive from each other. And although I didn't know him personally, the more I studied him, the deeper a connection I felt with the child and teenager Breivik used to be. So why did he become a mass killer when I became a loving mother who wrote a book about his atrocious crime? In an attempt to shed some light on Breivik's and all lone wolves' motivations, I'm going to tell you a story, my story. I grew up in a perfectly normal, middle-class Norwegian family. My parents are well-educated and had good jobs. I had everything I needed, except for one thing. I grew up not knowing that I had value as an individual. And I say this without judgment because my parents are good people and they raised me as well as they could with what they knew. As a child, I learned that the only thing that mattered was to be part of the group and not stand out. I just wanted to fit in and be just like the others. And from time to time, I experienced bullying and exclusion. And I never felt I belonged. I just pretended I did. Breivik wrote at length about this stifling part of the Norwegian culture in which acceptance by the group means survival, and being different is frowned upon. He believed very strongly that anyone in Norway trying to excel a bit too hard was denigrated. Jesper Juel, the Danish family therapist, said that a child whose integrity is violated doesn't stop loving his parents. He stops loving himself. Our integrity is violated by beliefs that go against our inner truth. Beliefs that say, I'm worthless. I don't deserve to be loved. I will never be enough. Breivik and I have this conditioning in common. And when we human beings don't love ourselves, we feel shame. Shame for not being good enough and for not being accepted by our societies. We feel insignificant and powerless. Shame and the consequences it can lead to is an epidemic in all of our cultures, not only in Norway. It survives because it's unspeakable. We have all been conditioned by our parents and societies. And most of us, no matter where we live, struggle or have at some point struggled with self-value, shame, and disconnection. But few suffer more than the lone wolf. Dr. Brené Brown, the famous researcher, says that shame is deeply correlated with addiction, depression, suicide, bullying, and violence. It is when we feel shame and powerless that we're the most dangerous to ourselves and others. Powerlessness leads to fear and desperation. And the most extreme end result to this suffering is mass murder. Breivik didn't have a stable family situation like I did. His parents divorced when he was a baby, and he had very little contact with his father, who was a diplomat. But I can relate to some of his suffering growing up, trying to be my own person and at the same time fit in. Norway's particular culture was a facilitator in Breivik's process to becoming a killer. But other cultures can contribute to one's sense of isolation in similar ways. An example of that is Timothy McVeigh, the man behind the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, in which 168 people were killed. Having been a soldier during Operation Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf in 1991, McVeigh couldn't tolerate his government's cover-up of civilian casualties during that war. It troubled him that the army would lie to its soldiers and the American people about what was really going on. And this made him question his near-blind devotion to the army and his own government. And when he quit the army, he found civilian life equally disillusioning. Nobody was interested in welcoming a war hero back into the workforce, and he grew increasingly embittered with the system. It's important to understand that the army gave McVeigh that sense of belonging that he needed and that he hadn't found anywhere else. And without the army, he felt lost. Because most of these killers don't have any interactions with the police until after they've struck, there is very little law enforcement can do. So identifying a mass killer in the making must be brought down to a community level, to you and me. There are always warning signs. Sometimes they're subtle, sometimes they're like bright red flags. Breivik was flagged for stockpiling fertilizer, a common bomb-making ingredient, but nothing was done. Had law enforcement looked into his case, they would have found a suspicious behavioral pattern if they knew what to look for. And Breivik would have been revealed as a threat. And what about his neighbors around his pseudo-farm that he had set up to be able to order all those chemicals to build his bomb? They saw a city slicker with no experience in farming who covered up all the windows to his house. They all thought it was suspicious, yet they did nothing. Looking back at the cases of notable lone wolf killers, they all share a set of similar characteristics. And these are the warning signs. Attachment issues from early childhood. These are typically the kids who don't really play or interact with the other kids. And because of these attachment issues, they can't connect or have meaningful relationships as adults. Humans are hardwired to connect with each other to survive. And the lone wolf suffers for years before taking action. Since they can't connect to other people, they instead connect with an ideology, as if it were a person. And it's this unhealthy relationship that leads to grandiose acts of violence because the killer believes that he's killing not for himself, but for his cause. They have medium to high intelligence, sometimes genius level. And in the cases of Breivik and McVeigh, they were highly sensitive children. They experienced not only isolation, but also reported being the victims of bullying. Now, this bullying may not have been very serious or long-lasting, but it set up a system of perceived injustice that they felt they must rectify. Has anyone heard of dandelion children here? Please raise your hand. Well, you probably know that the dandelion is a resilient flower. It can grow almost anywhere, even in a crack by a polluted road. Orchids, on the other hand, are beautiful and sophisticated, but fragile flowers. They need very specific care. According to Swedish folk wisdom, most children are like dandelions and grow despite of their circumstances, no matter how harsh. Orchid children, as opposed to dandelion children, are extremely sensitive to their environments, especially to the quality of the parenting they receive. If neglected, orchid children wither. But if they're nurtured, they not only survive, they flourish. All the lone wolves I studied were orchid children. Children with potential for greatness or great destruction. Now this is important, because Norway's particular culture, where Breivik felt denigrated, suppressed, and excluded, might not have had such an effect on a different person. But because of the orchid child's sensitive and reactive psyche, it had a huge impact on Breivik. Now, let's get back to our list of warning signs. They have a lot of rage and a need to strike back. They're narcissistic, and this trait can sometimes confuse us into thinking they're psychopaths. They're not. The lone wolves don't lack empathy. They overcare about themselves because they think no one else does. They have an unmet need for recognition and a desire to live. Unlike typical rampage killers, the lone wolves are not suicidal. In their narcissistic view, they're too essential to their cause to be sacrificed. Most often, lone wolves go ignored until they're headline making violence. Nobody bothered to investigate Breivik's stockpiling of weapons and bomb-making materials. Nobody reported his retreat to the isolated, violent world of the computer games he played up to 16 hours per day. No one paid attention to his ranting or to his failed attempts to participate in extreme political groups. And as is the case with all of these lone wolves, nobody in their lives feels that they matter enough to be dangerous. And so the way they get others to acknowledge their existence is through these violent acts. Spreading the knowledge about these warning signs and being more aware of our surroundings and the people in it is not only possible, it's vitally necessary. The lone wolf is one of us. He's your neighbor, classmate, friend, brother, or son. Simon Sinek said at a TED Talk in 2014 that if you get the environment right, every single one of us has the capacity to do remarkable things. So let's include the outliers into our circle of safety, that circle of trust and cooperation, and give them a sense of belonging. And I'm saying this with a lot of humility, because out of all the mistakes that I made in my life, the ones I regret the most are situations where I failed to be kind, to show empathy. Those moments when another person was alone and suffering right in front of me, and I responded by doing nothing or not enough. How many of you have, at some point, perhaps in school, chosen to be liked over defending someone who needed being defended? Or maybe you didn't include someone out of fear that you would be excluded. Bullying is not only about what is said and done to a person, it's also about what you don't do. We need to find the courage to really be there for one another, because no one can go the distance alone. Margaret Mead once said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, It's the only thing that ever has. So on the back of these words of wisdom, I'd like to end my talk with 3 calls for action. Number 1, we need to be more aware of the people around us, to care a little more. Number 2, when we notice some of the lone wolf characteristics in someone, do something about it. Talk to someone. Reach out. Law enforcement needs our help to identify potential mass killers. And I'm not talking about a witch hunt, but about taking the time to notice what's going on in your immediate environment. And that leads me to number 3. We need to be kinder to people who are different, even the outliers who don't fit in. Include them, and let's stop the bullying, especially now with the cyberbullying and public shaming going on. Bullying in any form is unacceptable, yet it happens everywhere. And research proves that young boys who are bullied tend to become aggressive and violent as they grow up. I encourage each one of you to be the spark in creating a more caring and inclusive environment around you. All children are born beautiful and untainted, including the lone wolves. Something happened to them along the way. And by recognizing the warning signs and giving them the help they need before they become killers, we can prevent the next massacre and help them rise to greatness instead of letting them sink into that spiral of destruction.